they start treating you, whether you are Hamas or not Hamas, whether you are secular or religious, whoever you happen to be. If you are a Palestinian, you are accused. And they want you to apologize, they want you to express sorrow. They don't want to understand from you why this violence is continuing.
We are all watching the events unfolding in Gaza and Israel this week and wondering how they will end. It begins in the early hours of Saturday, October 7, when Palestinian militants launch a surprise operation, breaking through the Israeli border fence, breaking through the siege of Gaza for the first time in 16 years, using hang gliders, bulldozers, and foot soldiers, firing rockets at Israeli cities as a decoy. Then they storm a number of Israeli settlements and military outposts in southern Israel, attempting to gain strategic ground before Israel can react. They take a number of hostages, military and civilian, back to Gaza, where they will likely be used to bargain for the release of Palestinian prisoners. More than 800 Israelis have been killed so far, a large number of them civilians, including dozens at a music festival near Gaza's border. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu declared the beginning of a war, vowing to reduce the entire Gaza Strip to rubble and warning Palestinians to evacuate, though where they can leave to is unclear. Israel's defense minister announced a complete siege, saying there will be no electricity, no food, no fuel. Israel's army then launched several days of airstrikes on Gaza, leveling high-rise buildings, targeting vital infrastructure, and cutting access to more than 2 million people. At least 500 Palestinians, including several entire families, have so far been killed. But that number is expected to rise dramatically in the coming days and weeks. As we speak, gun battles continue in a number of Israeli towns and outposts in an attempt to clear all militants from the area. International voices and media outlets have condemned the attack by Hamas, the de facto ruling party in Gaza, calling it unprovoked. But, as always, context is everything. What is the context of Gaza? Since 2007, Israel has placed it under a complete military siege, blocking its access to land, air, and sea. Palestinians living in Gaza cannot leave, cannot return, without the explicit permission of Israel's government. Israel also controls the Strip's access to water, electricity, fuel, building and medical supplies, humanitarian aid, money, and internet access. Israel surrounds Gaza with a heavily patrolled border fence by land. Its navy surrounds its sea border, limiting Palestinian access to fishing, trade, and travel, and by air, where its surveillance drones hover overhead night and day. Gaza has regularly been described by human rights organizations as the world's largest open-air prison. Over the last 16 years, Israel has also launched 5 major military operations into Gaza, killing more than 6,000 people, the vast majority of whom have been civilians, thousands of children included. Armed or unarmed, any attempt for Palestinians to escape the siege has been met with overwhelming force. In 2018, Palestinians marched unarmed towards the Israeli border fence in a peaceful attempt to break through the siege. It was called the Great March of Return. Israeli snipers responded by killing 223 protesters, including at least one medical worker. They also maimed thousands of young men by deliberately targeting their ankles, leaving many of them with amputated legs. Gaza has struggled to recover, build, and heal from each of these attacks, and in 2020 the United Nations declared the region had become unlivable. At the same time, attacks by Israeli soldiers as well as Israeli settlers have spiked in recent months in the West Bank. More than 150 Palestinians have been killed this year, beating last year's record of 146. This according to Israeli human rights organizations. In Jerusalem, Al-Aqsa Mosque has been raided repeatedly by Israeli forces, and worshippers have been attacked and arrested during prayer services as well as during the holy month of Ramadan. This to make way for Jewish worshippers to enter the compound in violation of Israel's own laws. Israel's far-right government, headed by figures like Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, have openly campaigned for a policy of annexing the West Bank and Jerusalem into Israel and expelling all Palestinians. Smotrich is currently the Minister of Finance and Ben-Gvir the Minister of National Security. Finally, in the last 2 years, the world's most reputable human rights organizations, including Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and Israel's B'Tselem, have concluded the treatment of Palestinians by Israel amounts to a system of apartheid, comparable to that of apartheid South Africa. This is the context. It is not only vital to understanding what is happening now, but to understand why it is happening. With this context in mind, and bearing the devastating and heartbreaking death toll of Palestinians and Israelis alike, we need to talk about what Palestinian resistance is, where it comes from, and what drives it today. Welcome to The Big Picture, a show about the past, the present, and the future. My name is Mohammed Hassan, and today I sit down with British Palestinian thinker Dr. Azzam Tamimi. Dr. Tamimi was born in Hebron in the West Bank and spent most of his life as a refugee on the outside. He's been an outspoken voice on the Palestinian issue as an academic and as a political activist. He is currently the chairman of Al Hawar TV channel and its editor-in-chief. Dr. Azzam Tamimi, thank you for joining us. Welcome to The Big Picture.
Thank you.
Can I begin by asking you to describe how you see what is happening today?
What is happening really came as a surprise to myself and to many people. Though once you go back and think of the situation, you'd come to the conclusion that this was inevitable. Nothing was working. The peace process was a sham. The Israelis were becoming increasingly more fanatic, combining Zionism with religion, which is a combustible cocktail. And the Palestinians were left either under siege or under occupation. More land lost, more people put in prison, more people killed. And therefore this explosion was waiting to happen.
And I think we are used to seeing the kind of reaction that comes from Gaza to be rockets. What is different this time? What are we seeing happening from Hamas, from Al-Qassam?
You mentioned the rockets. There was a time when Hamas didn't even have rockets. There was a time when they were so desperate, so they resorted to suicide bombings or martyrdom operations, as they called them. When resistance started in the very early days of the Uprising of 1987, they used knives. And then someone stole a rifle from an Israeli soldier, and it started there. And whenever the Israelis cracked down on them and used blind and massive power to crush them, they just innovated something new. They came up with something new. And apparently today, Hamas and the other Palestinian factions have new weaponry, have new preparedness to take the Israelis by surprise.
And the Israelis have clearly been taken by surprise. And as we're speaking, there are still attempts to try and push back the militants that made it into southern Israel and to secure that area. And there's been declarations of war from the Israeli government and warnings that Gaza will be essentially reduced to rubble. What do you read in the Israeli reaction?
Well, the Israeli reaction is not unprecedented, by the way. In 2008, 2009, they almost leveled Gaza to the ground. The war then lasted more than 50 days, and there were thousands of Palestinian casualties, massive destruction across the strip. But we seem to forget, because people recover, they rebuild, and they resume their normal lives. But in the shadow, there are those who are preparing for confrontation, and simply because the cause for confrontation has not disappeared. The Israelis had numerous opportunities to end this conflict. And the most significant one was the Oslo Agreement. Had they given Yasser Arafat a state, even if it were a non-viable state, that would probably have changed things on the ground. But actually, they've used the peace process to further humiliate the Palestinians, to confiscate more of their lands, to subjugate them more and more. And therefore, we saw what has happened.
If I can ask you about Hamas, you mentioned the Oslo Accords and Yasser Arafat and the attempt, on paper at least, to create some sort of functioning government representation on both within Palestine but also internationally on behalf of the Palestinians, which didn't really exist before. But it was also an attempt to put an end to this era of Palestinian militancy. But despite that, we have Hamas now, who is very much, as far as anybody outside of Palestine can see, represents that idea of Palestinian militancy today. Who is Hamas, and what kind of conditions brought them to the surface?
Well, Hamas was originally the Muslim Brotherhood of Palestine. Was always a dispute within the Muslim Brotherhood prior to 1987 as to what to do about the occupation. The leadership maintained the position that we are incapable of defeating the occupation because our people are not ready. So what do we need to do in the meantime? We need to pay attention to education, to religious awareness, and things of this sort, to reforming society, to getting people to adhere to Islamic values. And when the Fatah movement was performing resistance, and the other factions like the PFLP and the others, these factions were accusing the Muslim Brotherhood of not performing a duty and of discouraging young men who belong to the movement from resisting. Now, the situation under occupation, the occupation of Gaza started in 1967 and the West Bank as well. By 1987, the situation had deteriorated profoundly, that the Palestinians felt so humiliated that they erupted in an intifada or an uprising. When the uprising happened, the leadership of the Brotherhood in Gaza held an emergency meeting. They included Sheikh Ahmad Yassin, they included Rantisi, Hassan Sham'a, several others, and they decided that it was no longer tenable for them to remain silent. And they transformed themselves with a statement that reached the media on the 9th of December 1987 into what they called the Islamic Resistance Movement, short Hamas. The acronym is Hamas. Now, initially, it was really about civil disobedience. But the crackdown on the intifada by the Israelis was severe, that Palestinians individually started acting. As I mentioned earlier, it started with using knives against Israeli soldiers. Then they started robbing Israeli soldiers of their rifles whenever that was possible. And it developed as such. By 1994, when an Israeli settler by the name of Goldstein, Baruch Goldstein, entered into the Ibrahimi Mosque in my hometown, Al-Khalil, Hebron, and massacred Palestinian worshippers. That was the 15th day of Ramadan, the 25th of February 1994. Hamas decided to use the human bomb because they said, we are defenseless. We cannot protect ourselves, and there is nothing with which we can deter these settlers and these occupiers. So they adopted tool. And it was devastating for the Israelis to the extent that the Israelis went to see, some Israeli leaders went to see Sheikh Ahmed Yassin in prison. He had already been in prison. They went to see him and asked him, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, how can we put an end to this bloodshed? And he came up with the idea that became known later on as the Hudna, or the long-term truce. He said to them, if you stop killing us, we'll stop killing you. And we are willing to enter into a long-term truce with you, provided you withdraw your settlers, you release our prisoners, and end occupation. But rather than heed his advice or take him seriously, they started they increased their violence against the Palestinians. And this has been the story since then. I mean, the Israelis think they have the power with which they can crush the resistance. But resistance never dies. So long as the people are occupied, there will continue to be a generation that will resort to resistance in order to gain freedom.
And I think that the tactics that you mentioned with regards to the use of suicide bombers by some Hamas members was kind of the introduction to a lot of people internationally to who Hamas is as an organization. Especially, I mean, the scenes of school buses and cafes being targeted during that period of time were really used by Israel to justify what was happening, what the retaliation that it was describing as it did, and then in 2006 and 2007 when the siege began, it was still the same kind of logic that was being used, that Hamas is different, we can't deal with them, and today, you are seeing that same kind of language resurface again with the reports of Israeli civilians being killed. That idea within Hamas, is it something that is sanctioned? Does that logic still sort of prevail with regards to the tactics that Hamas uses, or is it something that has been resisted internally?
No, they're no longer using the suicide bombings as a tactic. They replaced that with the rockets. And now we're seeing them adding to the rockets new tactics. So there is a continuous change. I think the martyrdom operations or the suicide bombings became a liability for Hamas when they started being used by other groups elsewhere. You see, in the case of Palestine, in the case of Hamas felt it was justified in using that tactic, provided it targeted military installations. And it was nearly abandoned. You see, the Israelis will always justify what they're doing. It's easy for them, because they are the occupiers, they are the invaders. And regrettably, outside the Arab region, most people are influenced by what the mainstream Western media says about the issue in Palestine. And usually the story is never told from the start. It's a long story. I mean, we're talking about 100 years. And invariably in the Western media, they're only interested in the question when there are Israeli casualties. Israel might do something to the Palestinians. Nobody cares. Nobody reports it. So, had it not been for the social media, probably people would never hear of it. But when something happens to the Israelis, immediately it becomes headlines everywhere. And that shows the bias. And that bias, for me, is understandable, because Israel is the invention of the West. Israel is seen by Western governments and a proportion of Western public opinion as something that is part of them. Because it's westernized, they consider it to be a democracy, although it's an apartheid democracy. And also because had it not been for the will of the powers that won in the First and Second World Wars, Israel would never have existed.
And like any sort of international conflict, when you have two sides that are vying for the international attention. It is a conflict of optics. And increasingly, definitely within the Western mainstream imagination, Israel has always been able to win that battle of optics. Why do you think Palestinians have not been able to receive or, impart their side of the conflict as effectively as the Israelis have for decades now?
When you switch on the BBC or CNN or Sky News, when you read the papers that are published in London or in Washington or in New York, what they write about Israel, it's something they write about themselves. So even if they bring a Palestinian in as a commentator, he is the accused. I mean, today there's so much row in the social media about the fact that the BBC, CNN, Sky News, all of them, without exception, when they invite a Palestinian commentator, the first question they ask, would you condemn what Hamas has been doing? I mean, why do you ask him this question? It happened to me so many times when they used to invite me. Now they don't invite me anymore, by the way. But they start treating you, whether you are Hamas or not Hamas, whether you are secular or religious, whoever you happen to be. If you are a Palestinian, you are accused. And they want you to apologize. They want you to express sorrow. They don't want to understand from you why this violence is continuing. So actually, to answer your question, the Palestinians are not treated fairly. They are not given enough space. Maybe we don't have enough sufficient people, or probably in the past we didn't have enough people to really talk eloquently about our cause. But we did have some excellent people, Edward Said, others. Today you have excellent people who can speak to the media. They are not invited unless there is a big catastrophe to Israel like today. And if they are invited, they are put in the dock and they're treated as if they are guilty.
First and foremost, do you condemn what Hamas did inside Israel to Israeli civilians?
Will you condemn the onslaught by Hamas? You just condemned Israel for killing civilians, and you won't condemn Hamas for killing civilians.
How many times you have interviewed Israeli officials, Louise? Hundreds of times. Hundreds of times. How many times Israel have committed war crimes right live on your own cameras? Do you start by asking them to condemn themselves? Have you? You don't. You don't. No, I'll answer that question. You don't. You know why I refuse to answer this question? Because I refuse the premise of it. Because at the very heart of it is misrepresentation of the whole thing. Because it's the Palestinians that are always expected to condemn themselves.
If I can take you back to 1947, 1948, the creation of the State of Israel, and the beginnings of the resistance movement from Palestinians, which obviously began before 1948. How did that resistance begin, and what did it look like, and how did it transform over time?
Well, the resistance started with the British colonialism. My grandfather, for instance, was involved in the resistance against the British. My father was involved in the resistance against the Israelis. There was a time between 1930 and 1948 when the Palestinians found themselves fighting along two fronts, the British occupiers and the Zionist infiltrators, because the British who were colonizing, or the British actually were having the mandate over Palestine, opened the gates for Jewish migration from around the world and enabled the Zionists to arm themselves, to train and to really prepare for seizing the land and taking over. The Palestinians were always the weaker party in terms of material capabilities. Unfortunately, much of the Arab world in 1948 was still under colonialism, whether French or British. Leaders or commanders of Arab armies were actually either French or British. So you can imagine that in 1948, when Israel declared itself, there was no real war, really. There was no real war. They claimed that the Arab armies came in and they were defeated. Nonsense. The only people who put up resistance were the Palestinians led by Abdul Qadir al-Husseini, and my father was part of his group, Jihad al-Muqaddas it used to be called. And there were also volunteers from various Arab countries, from Egypt in particular, the Muslim Brotherhood, volunteers, and volunteers from North Africa, from Arabia, from various parts. But they were no match to the Zionist gangs who were well armed and who perpetrated massacres purposefully in order to frighten the Palestinians out of the land. I mean, take the case of my mother, for instance. My mother was born in Beersheba, which was occupied in 1948 in the Negev. And she spent the first 16 or 17 years of her life there. When she was about 16 or 17 years old, they heard the news of what happened in Deir Yassin, and that these Zionists were really massacring civilians left and right. They decided to lock the house and go and spend some time with the rest of the family in Hebron, where my father was born, until things improve. And they were told that a few days the Arab armies would defeat the Zionists and you'll be able to come back. They never could go back. Palestine was lost. 2/3 of Palestine was lost in 1948. The Palestinians didn't have much to defend themselves with, because the British did an excellent job stripping them even of knives in their houses, lest they are used against the Zionists. But of course, after that, the Palestinian issue continued to be used by Arab regimes in order to gain legitimacy, but actually none of them did anything tangible about liberating Palestine.
And then from that begins this these grassroots movements of resistance fighters, and then they take shape over time and they become organizations, and you have the rise of Yasser Arafat, who becomes...
Well, before that, Fatah, the idea of creating Fatah materialized in 1957. So we're talking here about 10 years, nearly 9-10 years after Israel came to existence. Because the Palestinians were wounded, they were scattered, they were refugees, they were helpless. But a group of educated Palestinians, including Yasser Arafat, and most of the other members of the group actually were former members of the Muslim Brotherhood, who were angry with the Muslim Brotherhood because the Muslim Brotherhood said, we tried fighting the Zionist project in 1948, it didn't work. The problem is that you have to liberate the Muslim world first before you liberate Palestine. This was the ideology at the time. So Yasser Arafat and this group, which included people like Khalil al-Wazir, Abu Jihad, Salah Khalaf, Abu Iyad, Kamal Adwan, Yusuf al-Najjar, and others, came together in Kuwait and decided to create Fatah. They created Fatah, but actually the first operation ever was on the 1st of January 1965. So it took quite a while. And Fatah was suspicious of the Arab League's creation of the PLO, because the PLO wasn't really created by the Palestinians. The PLO was created by the Arab League in 1964. Of course, there were Palestinians involved, but the idea was to tell the Palestinians, okay, this is your liberation organization, go ahead and liberate your land. So as if the Arabs were absolving themselves of the responsibility for Palestine. The earlier thinking, the earlier mindset was that the creation of a Zionist entity in Palestine was not targeting the Palestinians, it was targeting the entire Ummah, Arab and Islamic. Regrettably, this gradually disappeared. So Fatah initially thought that the PLO was a conspiracy against the Palestinian cause. But after 1968, especially after Al-Karama battle, when Fatah and the other factions that were created were stationed in Jordan, and they managed to defeat, together with some units from the Jordanian army, to defeat the Israelis Fatah took over the PLO, of course with the blessings of the Arab countries that created the PLO in the first place. However, what happened in the 70s, and especially after Sadat decided to make peace with Israel, is that the thinking within the PLO itself changed. And they started in 1974 with what is known as the 10 Points document, which for the first time expresses the willingness to settle for a Palestinian state next to Israel. And that was a big shock for many Palestinians.
And this is during the time post 1967, which is slightly different to today, where Israel effectively controls the entire area. There's no even kind of on paper what the West Bank and Gaza is. This is just an entirely...
True.
Yeah.
The whole thing was, yes, the whole thing. And that's why there was resistance from Jordan, later on from Lebanon, because they were driven out of Jordan, they went to Lebanon, and then they were driven out of Lebanon, they went to Tunisia, and Yemen and Sudan, far away from the front. But what I'm trying to narrate here is the progress. When Fatah and the PLO started lowering their ceiling and expressing readiness to accept a peaceful settlement with Israel, this paved the way for the emergence of Hamas. And that's why in 1987, when the Intifada happened and Hamas came to existence, Yasser Arafat was horrified because he had already been involved in secret talks with the Americans and with the Israelis. And that explains why the Israelis and the PLO went along and concluded the Oslo deal. For the PLO, Hamas was a threat. For the Israelis, the Intifada was a threat. So they wanted to combine their efforts together in the hope that they can avoid what we see today.
And then the Oslo Accord is signed and the Palestinian Authority is established, and there is, on paper at least, a Palestinian president and a government that can speak on behalf of Palestinians everywhere. What happens to the idea of Palestinian resistance during that time?
Well, you see, Yasser Arafat thought he was cleverer than the Israelis. He thought, okay, let me sign this deal with them. Because the deal initially was very simple. It's the PLO recognizing Israel in exchange for Israel recognizing the PLO as a legitimate representative of the Palestinians. So actually there was no recognition of a Palestinian state or even of a Palestinian self-determination, not yet. And they said, okay, let's, after this, start negotiating. And they put on the table the issues that needed to be negotiated, like settlements, the right of return, water, all sorts of things. The Israelis were not intending to give the Palestinians much. They only wanted the Palestinian Authority to become a security organ for them, an entity that acts on their behalf to help them control the population. Yasser Arafat realized this by the year 2000, when he went to Camp David, and they had a meeting, marathon meetings, hosted by Clinton at the time, attended by by Ehud Barak, the then Israeli Prime Minister, and Yasser Arafat. And Yasser Arafat realized that he was getting nothing of what he was hoping to get. Not only that, he was being asked to sign on paper away Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. And he said, enough is enough. So he went back and entered into a deal with Hamas and ignited the second Intifada in September 2000. And here the Israelis decided to finish him off. They went after him. They destroyed his Palestinian Authority, which they built themselves. And they eventually assassinated him and installed Mahmoud Abbas in his place. But it was too late. It was too late because for the Palestinians it was clear what was going on. And Hamas was actually gaining while Fatah was losing. And this is what led to Hamas winning the elections in 2006. Mahmoud Abbas begged George W. Bush not to force him to do the elections. George W. Bush wanted to be seen to allow elections in various parts of the region as part of his accomplishments after invading Iraq. Mahmoud Abbas told them Hamas would win. They didn't believe him, and Hamas won. And as a result, the Israelis came up with what became known as the three Quartet Conditions. First, recognize Israel's right to exist. Second, disarm and demilitarize. Third, accept all the agreements signed by the PLO so far. So, in other words, become another PLO, become another Fatah. And that was impossible. And this is where the siege on Gaza came from.
And since then, there's been this division between who speaks on behalf of Palestinians and who controls what parts of Palestinian territories. You have the Fatah and the PA in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and you have Hamas in Gaza. But that rivalry didn't really stop, did it?
No, it hasn't stopped. And that rivalry started with a very regrettable bloodshed that happened in 2007. See, as a result of Hamas rejecting the three conditions of the quartet, the Americans sent General Dayton, who collaborated with some of the elements within the Palestinian Authority in order to bring Hamas down. Because Hamas was, at least officially, the government of the day, both in Gaza and the West Bank. And this led to confrontation, and there was a bloodshed that resulted in Hamas being uprooted in the West Bank and Fatah uprooted in Gaza. It's a very sad situation, but this was the American design. They thought they could finish off Hamas. Hamas actually defended itself quite well in Gaza, couldn't defend itself in the West Bank, so lost the West Bank but gained Gaza.
And since then, there's been this siege on Gaza in an attempt by Israel to control Hamas. And in Fatah, in the West Bank, there's been accusations on behalf of the PA of them trying to control Hamas's influence there. Have they succeeded?
Well, in the West Bank, because the West Bank is still under occupation, the Palestinian Authority works in liaison with the Israeli army, and they managed to maintain control in the West Bank. The Palestinian Authority has several security apparatuses, and they all have one function: control the Palestinians. And according to the agreement between them, as part of the security coordination, whenever the Israeli army enters into a Palestinian area, Palestinian Authority security forces withdraw. So this is the job of the Israelis.
We saw that happening in Jenin earlier
Yes,
this year.
it's been happening all the while. And because they couldn't do the same thing in Gaza, they put Gaza under siege. So the West Bank is under occupation. Gaza has no settlements or settlers or Israelis in it, but it is under siege from all sides. And this is what led to the explosion. And I think eventually there will be an explosion in the West Bank as well, because the situation in the West Bank is getting worse. The popularity of Abbas and the Palestinian Authority is record low. They are not trusted. People consider them to be lackeys of occupation. And it's just a matter of time. And we saw this happen during the previous, not the previous Ramadan, the Ramadan before, when we had something really which looked like an uprising. That can happen again.
And you're starting to see the emergence of these small armed groups in the West Bank, like the Jenin Brigades and like the Lions Brigades, who are attempting to create some sort of resistance movement in the West Bank. What does that look like to you, and how far do you think they have gone and able to achieve something of an uprising in the West Bank?
Well, this is indicative of the fact that Palestinians in the West Bank are very angry, and they want to do something. However, these endeavors have not been very successful simply because of the security coordination between the Palestinian Authority and the Israelis. I mean, imagine, this is not Gaza. This is the West Bank, where the Israelis divided the area into 3 zones. Zone A, Zone B, Zone C. Zone A is supposed to be run by the Palestinian Authority. Zone B is run by the Palestinian Authority, but the security in it is for Israel. Zone C is run by Israel, and the security is for Israel. Despite that, the Israelis can enter any area at any time and do whatever they want. So they assassinate, they destroy, they bomb, and regrettably, much of the intelligence they receive from the Palestinian Authority.
We've seen over the last couple of decades the first Intifada, which took place, which you described, which was followed up by the Oslo Accords and the increase of security coordination between the Palestinian representations in Israel. Then there was the second Intifada, which was followed by Israel with the creation of the security border, the increase of checkpoints across the West Bank, and really control of movement in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem that wasn't there before. And a couple of years later, you saw the siege of Gaza, which remains today. Hamas has been calling for a third Intifada, a third uprising, and over the last couple of days, it's called for a similar uprising to happen in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem, as well as in the so-called 48 cities, the Palestinian cities in Israel. What mood do you think exists among Palestinians, ordinary Palestinians, for this kind of uprising or an Intifada to happen again, keeping in mind the consequences that people are very well aware of?
You see, an uprising is not an easy thing because it's not something that you can start yourself. It usually happens simultaneously, spontaneously, I should say. And it's usually triggered by an event of some sort, something unexpected. Like in 1987, it was an Israeli trailer driver who crushed several Palestinian workers. But the situation was already boiling. Now, 2000 was a little bit of an exception because not really a big exception, because the people were angry and things were getting really bad. But Yasser Arafat wanted an intifada to happen. But he thought he could have a measured intifada, just to pressure the Israelis to make some concessions. That didn't happen. So it got out of hand. Now the West Bank, unlike Gaza, is permeated with agents, with intelligence of all sorts, reconnaissance, spying, and therefore it's not easy. Movements can easily be preempted, particularly with the security coordination between the Palestinian Authority and the Israelis. But who knows? Something might happen that will trigger an explosion. And I think the overwhelming, the general sentiment in the West Bank today is very supportive of Gaza, very supportive of what Hamas did to the Israelis, because they feel, okay, now our brothers in Gaza are punishing those who have been punishing us. This is the sentiment, and this is very embarrassing for Mahmoud Abbas and the people who work for him. Yet, a sizable proportion of the people of the West Bank rely for their living on the salaries they receive from the Palestinian Authority and from the international donors. This is what...
And from Israel.
And from Israel. And this is what the peace process did. The peace process created classes within the Palestinian community, created categories. There are people who today benefit from the occupation. And they fear that if the occupation is ended, they will lose their privileges. This is a very dangerous phenomenon in Palestinian society. But we have to admit it exists. Regrettably, it exists. Is it likely to be reversed? I think so. I think so, because eventually these are families. I mean, within the same family, you find people who are anti-occupation, there are people who work for the occupation. Eventually, something
Hamas supporters and Fatah supporters, yeah.
within the same family, and this, by the way, happens in all cases. I mean, it happens in Vietnam, in Algeria, in Iraq, everywhere. This is the nature of humans. But something eventually happens that changes the course of events.
Do you feel like there's an appetite for it?
I think so, especially with the change that we've seen within Israeli society itself. Israeli society has changed massively. You see, the founding fathers of Zionism were secularists, were atheists. Religion for them did not really matter much. They only used it as slogans to justify Zionism. And there's a brilliant book by John Rose about this called The Myths of Zionism, where he explains that people like Ben Gurion and the others were actually using the Torah and the Talmud simply to justify what they did, what they committed, because the rest of the religious community in world Jewry was against them. However, today, there is a new settler mentality that combines Zionism with Judaism. And today they are the government in Israel. They are not interested in any sort of settlement, any sort of peace with the Palestinians. They truly believe that this is God-given to them. I mean, the secularists before claimed it, but they didn't believe in it. No, these guys believe in it, and they are the ones who were agitating and provoking and rallying settlers to enter into Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa and humiliate the Palestinians and threaten to take Al-Aqsa from them or even destroy it. I think this leads to a volcanic eruption. It's just a matter of time.
Finally, Dr. Azzam, in light of what's happening today and in the coming days, we all are keeping an eye on the events as they unfold. It's hard to predict how they will unfold. What do you think is important for people to keep in mind when they try and read what is happening through the headlines, through social media, on the ground, and on the internet?
Well, people need to know that this has been going on for 100 years. And it's unlikely that it will be resolved tomorrow or the day after. This is likely to drag on. But definitely things are changing. And they are changing not in favor of Israel. The Palestinians are in pain, and the Israelis have the capacity to cause them a lot more pain. Yet this will not put an end to their resistance and determination to become free. So the struggle will go on, and I think people who hear us probably and who would like to do something about the cause should start with educating themselves about the roots of the problem, about the facts, because there's so much around us that is not true. So equip oneself about the facts, and then start educating people around you. And this is how we can enlighten public opinion about the reality of what goes on. Palestine is like South Africa, is like Vietnam, is like Algeria, an area that was invaded, that was occupied by a foreign power, and the people of that, the indigenous population, was subjected to persecution, to dispossession, to all sorts of war crimes, and they are struggling for freedom. This is the story.
Dr. Azzam Tamimi, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching this episode of The Big Picture. Thank you to Dr. Azzam Tamimi for his time and his analysis on the history of Palestinian resistance. We would like to hear from you on your thoughts over this conversation, as well as your reaction to everything that is happening on the ground in Gaza, in the Palestinian territories, in Israel. As always, you can find this and all of our episodes in audio format wherever you get your podcast from. Until next time, my name is Muhammad. Salam.